Greater Waco Chamber of Commerce Small Business Power Hour, sponsored by the First National Bank of Central Texas. And then also we have a gold sponsor with Spectrum Reach. My name is Rick Tullis, the current chairman of the chamber this year, Chamber Board of Directors. And I want to welcome you guys for being here, and thank you for your patience as we were pulling everything together. Sometimes things take a little longer than expected. So thank you. I'm excited to introduce Senator Ted Cruz, who doesn't need a whole lot of introduction. He's been our senator since 2013, and we are thankful for his service, and we're looking forward to hearing his remarks. The order of the program, Senator Cruz will give some opening remarks, and then Matt Metters and myself will ask him a few questions. We'll have a few minutes here to do that. As a participant, you can log a question in the Q&A section probably at the bottom of your screen if you're on a PC, and we'll be watching those live Q&A questions, and we will ask those of the senator as time allows. So, with that being said, Senator Cruz, thank you for being in Waco, kind of, today.
Well, Rick, thank you very much. Thank you for having me, and thank you for everyone coming out today and participating. I wish I were there physically, in person. I wish I were able to go to a Baylor football game, but although it's wrong time of year for that anyway. But I wish I were there in person with each of you, and ordinarily I would be in a time of crisis. What I try to do is be on the ground with people who are impacted, who are feeling the circumstances. But obviously during a pandemic of this nature, having a large in-person gathering is not advisable. And so I'm happy for the joys of technology that we can do this teletour that I'm engaged in statewide, traveling the state, to try to listen to the concerns, to hear the concerns of people who are directly impacted by what's happening. We are in extraordinary times right now. Everyone knows that. We are facing in Texas 3 simultaneous crises. We have, number one, a global health crisis, the coronavirus pandemic. It is serious. Over 140,000 people have died worldwide, and we're taking extraordinary steps to limit the spread of this virus, to flatten the curve, and we've had some real success in doing so. We're facing, secondly, an economic crisis. That economic crisis is severe. In 4 weeks, we've seen over 22 million Americans lose their jobs. That's more than 10% of the entire U.S. workforce. We have millions of small businesses on the verge of bankruptcy. We have entire sectors of the economy that have been devastated. And this economic crisis is the direct consequence of governmental policies put in place to stop the spread of the pandemic. And then third, in Texas, we also have an energy crisis, an oil and gas crisis, because right in the midst of all the rest of this, Saudi Arabia and Russia decided to take advantage of the pandemic to flood the global market with oil and to cause the price of oil to drop in half. And that has had a massive impact on Texas energy producers who are at risk of going out of business and costing the state of Texas millions of jobs across the state. All 3 of those crises, we have robust public policy responses to them, fighting back on them, trying to turn them back. Dealing with each of those 3 crises has consumed virtually every waking moment of every day for me. And I trust that in the course of this conversation, we'll discuss all those policy responses. But really the purpose of this call is for me to hear from you, me to hear your concerns, me to hear your challenges, and talk through with it. And so let's open it up and let's have a conversation.
Great, thank you. Well, we got a first question here is about the stimulus packages that have come out, and a little bit of frustration of the earmarks being added to them that not necessarily were expected. So what do you think in the next rounds of stimulus packages that come out, what do you expect those to look like? And will there be a little bit more control on the spending?
Yeah, look, it is a great question. Congress has passed a total of three emergency bills in response to this crisis. By far the biggest was the CARES Act that we passed 3 weeks ago. That legislation is $2.2 trillion. That's a staggering sum. That is 10% of our national debt. And that, in ordinary times, that bill never would have passed. In ordinary times, there's no universe in which I'd be supporting something spending that much money. But these are not ordinary times. These crises that we're facing are extraordinary. They are generational. And I think there are a lot of elements of the CARES Act that make sense and that were important emergency relief. I don't think of the bill as a stimulus bill. I don't refer to it as a stimulus bill. Instead, it was designed to be an emergency relief bill to essentially give people short-term bridge loans to get through the crisis. So one big component of it is the individual component. Every American who earns $100,000 or less is going to receive direct assistance from the federal government, a check for $1,200 per adult, $500 per child. Those checks, many of them have gone out this week. And many more will be going out and being received next week. That is designed, that means a family, a couple with 3 kids who together earn $150,000 a year or less, will be getting a check for $3,900. That's real money if you've lost your job a few weeks ago. If you don't know how you're going to make the next rent payment, that's designed to be real money to help you just make it through this immediate challenge, to help you put food on the table. That individual relief was a significant component of the CARES Act. Another big component of the CARES Act was the Paycheck Protection Program. That is the program directed to small business. I suspect many of the people on this call are very familiar with the PPP program. That was $350 billion in emergency guaranteed loans to small businesses, largely defined as 500 employees or fewer. Those loans are administered through local banks, community financial institutions. And the unique aspect of that program is if the loan proceeds are used for paychecks or salaries, or mortgage or rent on the business, or utilities, the amount of those loans are forgivable. In other words, it becomes a grant. And that applies even if the small business had already been forced to lay off workers or to furlough workers because of the crisis. You can hire workers back, and the loan proceeds, the forgivable loans, can go to pay their salaries. And the entire purpose of this was to keep as many people as possible employed, keep them with their jobs, keep them in the relationship with their employer, keep them with their employer-provided health care. Last thing you want during a pandemic is a whole bunch of people losing their health insurance right as you go into it. And to keep those small businesses alive, so that when we get through this, when we are reopening the economy, which hopefully will start very, very soon, that those small businesses still are there and able to open their doors and able to be there to drive the economy forward. I think the Paycheck Protection Plan was the best component of the CARES Act. It had the most widespread bipartisan support, and the bill itself had overwhelming bipartisan support. In the Senate, it was unanimous. It was 96-0. Every Republican voted yes. Every Democrat voted yes. I voted yes, and Bernie Sanders voted yes. I mean, that is a wide array of views and policy perspectives. And, the process slowed down for a while. We had a bipartisan bill that had been negotiated in the Senate that both Republicans and Democrats had participated in drafting. Then at the last minute, Nancy Pelosi parachuted in and blew the whole thing up. And it was on Sunday, we were getting ready to pass it, and she came in with this list of partisan demands. And they were really egregious. There were things like trying to codify much of the Green New Deal, the radical environmental agenda that Democrats have. It was things like, and most of it was unrelated to the crisis. So, for example, she had very strict emission standards for airplanes. I gave a speech on the Senate floor where I said, what in the hell do airplane emission standards have to do with the coronavirus crisis? The answer was nothing. And after delaying the whole thing for 4 or 5 days, I think the Democrats, it wasn't tenable for them to hold their position. And so they withdrew most of those partisan demands, and we largely went back to the initial bipartisan bill that would have passed Sunday in the first place. There were some exceptions. Some of that pork that was put in there, there was $25 million for the Kennedy Center. I think that's unfortunate. I think that's a mistake. That was one of the demands the Democrats insisted on, and they stuck the pork in there. I wish it wasn't there. I will say, as big bills go, there was less of that in there than there is in many things Congress does. So it by no means was perfect. There are aspects of the bill I don't like, but I think we did a pretty good job keeping out the garbage that Pelosi was trying to jam in there and keeping it focused on the crisis. And I think that was the right thing to do.
Senator, good morning. Thank you very much for being with us. We really appreciate it. We have another question. Question is, how do you follow the money with this kind of emergency response bill? Where is it coming from, and what is the long-term impact on future taxpayers? And the question closed by thanking you for all you do.
Yeah, look, it is an awfully good question. And it depends on, anytime you have $2.2 trillion being spent, the volume of it is so great that, number one, it's overwhelming the federal agencies. Let's take, for example, the Small Business Administration that's administering the PPP program. Their budget this year was $23 billion. We just appropriated $350 billion to them. That's a 15x increase in their funding. They're frankly overwhelmed because the volume is greater than they were designed to handle. That's true. The Treasury Department right now is stretched to all ends. Is stretched completely. Here, hold on 1 second. I got to be a dad for a second. Yes, my love.
My next class.
So anyway, what we were talking about in terms of the accountability of the money, the volume of it is massive. There will be some problems in terms of where the money goes. On the individual checks, they're sending out checks to over 100 million Americans. There's going to be some dead people that got checks. There's going to be the volume is such that there are going to be some stories of money went to so-and-so and they spent it on, can you believe what they spent it on? Some of that's just inevitable. The Paycheck Protection Program, I've heard lots of frustrations about it. Wasn't as fast as it should be. There was bureaucratic delays. Look, some of that is also inherent in the beast. When you have a massive government bureaucracy, there is going to be bureaucracy. There's going to be red tape. My office has been trying to work with Treasury, trying to work with the Small Business Administration to streamline it, to move it as quickly as possible. But there are going to be bumps in the road. That you cannot fundamentally change the nature of a massive bureaucracy. If you look at the funding that went to the Federal Reserve, so part of the CARES Act was $450 billion that went to the Fed. For the Fed to leverage that up 10x, which means 4.5 trillion in liquidity in the market. And the objective there is to prevent a liquidity crisis from turning into a solvency crisis. In other words, countries with a short-term cash problem, you don't want them to have to shut everything down and auction off their assets at pennies on the dollars. Look, airlines. Right now, no commercial airline is viable. Why? Because nobody's flying. Their customers can't get on. You know, I flew up to DC a couple of weeks ago to meet with the president and CEOs of a number of big energy companies. I flew up on a commercial flight. I think there were 10 people on the flight going to DC. There were probably 12 people on the flight coming back. You can't run an airline with 10 people on a 737. That math doesn't work. If you're a hotel owner, I've talked with a lot of hotel owners, they're seeing 4, 5, 6% occupancy rates. There's no degree of math or accounting or government policy that can make a hotel a viable business with a 6% occupancy rate. It doesn't work without customers. And so, but what we don't want to see is we don't want to see this liquidity crisis right now force, for example, every airline to sell off all their airplanes at 10 cents on the dollar. That doesn't help anybody. To have a fire sale, you don't want to see the local pizzeria have to sell off their pizza oven at 10 cents on the dollar and not be able to open up a couple of weeks later. And so the liquidity that is coming from the CARES Act is designed, as I said, to be a short-term bridge loan to say, just stay alive, because it's government that's stopping you. And then this is a big distinction from 2008 and the financial crisis. 2008 and the financial crisis, many of the financial firms and Wall Street firms that received the assistance there had themselves contributed to the crisis. They had engaged in conduct that contributed to what went wrong. Here, the people being hurt, they didn't do anything. You know, the local restaurateur, it's not his fault the coronavirus pandemic is spreading the globe. And it is government policies that are inflicting these harms. So yes, we will need to have real oversight on the back end to find out where the money went, and some of it will have gone to questionable places. We gave $150 billion to state and local governments, $100 billion to hospitals. There's going to be some ugly stories about where some of that went. And on the back end, there should be some accountability. But I think where Congress leaned in was to move quickly to respond to the crisis, even recognizing that there would need to be some examination after the fact in terms of what went wrong.
So Senator Cruz, we've got several questions about the reopening of the economy. So President Trump put out a plan earlier this week. What do you think about that plan, and how do you think it would be executed in Texas?
So I think the plan makes a lot of sense. The president yesterday asked me to join his task force on reopening the economy. I spent a little over an hour on the phone with the president yesterday and with the vice president yesterday talking about exactly that, how to reopen the economy. And, you know, I've been doing teletour conversations the last couple of weeks all over the state of Texas. Have done them throughout East Texas, have done them throughout West Texas, have done them in North Texas, have done them down in the Valley, have done them in Central Texas. And conversations like this, really trying to listen to Texans all across the state. There is a consistency. Texans want to get back to work. I'm hearing that over and over and over again, that freezing our economy, shutting down the whole of the economy has massive, massive negative consequences. Now, as we get back to work, it needs to vary geographically. It needs to be based on the medical science and based on the facts on the ground. So there's some parts of the country where the rates of the virus spread are much higher. Look, New York City, the public health crisis that is playing out there, it is horrifying and horrific. No one in their right mind is arguing New Yorkers should go back to work tomorrow. But there are other parts of the country where the infection rates are much, much lower. And I think we need to look at both of these crises that have been created, because on the economic side, there are real public health consequences to this massive economic destruction. When you have 22 million people out of work in just 4 weeks, when you have millions of small businesses on the verge of bankruptcy, if we continue in place, destroying people's livelihoods, destroying people's businesses, people seeing their savings go up in smokes, people who have spent a lifetime building a small business seeing it disappear. If we keep down that path, we know there are going to be serious mental illness challenges. We know there's going to be increased depression. We know there's going to be increased risks of suicide. We know there's going to be increased substance abuse and alcohol abuse. All of those are real lives that will be lost if we continue down this path. So in my view, we need to balance the lives on both sides of the ledger. And our objective needs to be to protect life, to minimize the loss of life from the pandemic, yes, but from the economic devastation as well. And so the governor is expected this week to roll out his plan for getting Texas back to work. I expect every region of the state to look at the circumstances on the ground, about what are the circumstances here, and how can we get, and part of getting back to work involves looking at different slices of our population. The very vulnerable, those who are very elderly, those who have very serious health conditions, should stay home. They should continue to be quarantined. Those have been the populations most vulnerable to this virus, and we should protect those who are at greatest risk. But for young, healthy people, we need to be working to get as many of them back at work as quickly as possible, as many customers back as quickly as possible. And that doesn't necessarily mean we go back to exactly the way things were 3 months ago. It may mean we use protective equipment, we use gloves and masks where appropriate. It may mean, for example, that we do more social distancing, that restaurants have to reconfigure their dining room to spread tables out a little bit further to have a little bit more social distancing. We can take reasonable steps to mitigate the spread of the virus, but at the same time, we have got to get the economy moving again, because the question before about what do we do with all this spending and all this debt, the only thing strong enough to defeat it is getting the economy moving and roaring like it was a couple of months ago. We got to get back to that, and we got to get Texas back working and generating jobs and economic growth.
Senator, we want to be respectful of your time. We're going to ask 2 more questions because we know you're very, very busy. You have a lot of additional interviews and conversations coming up. So we have, as a chamber, over the past month, been having a lot of conversations with a lot of business leaders and a lot of folks who own companies, as you would expect. We've been bringing together industry sectors, et cetera. And so just recently, the conversation has turned. Individuals are saying, hey, we're receiving our PPP funds, but we're not an essential business. Our business is closed. And then in addition to that, there's some level of concern about when the economy is opened back up, how quickly will it start to become active, right? May stair step in, et cetera. And so the question that we're hearing almost in real time is, if I receive these PPP funds and I use them to take care of my employees, and we get down the road and we're finally able to open and all of or most of my PPP funds are exhausted, and my business opens to a 30 or 40 or 50% level of transactions as it was prior to, in terms of what it was prior to COVID, what does that mean for us?
So listen, I understand those concerns. I will say the PPP program was designed that if you use that money for salaries, it's forgivable, which means it becomes a grant. You don't have to pay it back. If you don't, you do have to pay it back. So it is a loan otherwise, and that was designed precisely because a lot of small business owners wouldn't necessarily use the funds to pay for salaries, particularly if the ability to work was substantially reduced. And we wanted to see as many people as possible stay in that employment relationship, stay connected to the employer, stay on the health insurance they're getting from their employer, stay getting a paycheck. And so that's why it's forgivable. I mean, there are not many instances where you have a guaranteed loan that is forgivable. That's designed for a very important public purpose. The distinction between essential and non-essential, that's what I think we need to very rapidly in Texas be moving to eliminate, to allow, quote, non-essential businesses to open up again and to have customers again. And I think that if we don't do that, the economic consequences will be irreparable. We can't afford to have the U.S. economy shut down for months and months and months. The devastation, the number of businesses that would be lost forever, that would be almost impossible to come back from. And so I have a real urgency to see Texans be able to go back and open up. And yes, it may take some time. If you own a restaurant, the first day you open your door, there may not be that many people there. If you own a movie theater, first day you open the door, and you may have to spread people out. You may have to say, okay, people got to sit 3 seats apart. That'll limit profitability. A movie theater with a bunch of your seats empty is not as profitable as a movie theater that's full, but you've got to have enough consumer confidence that you have anybody come out. And so I fully expect there will be a gradual ramp up. I also hope that when Congress passes the next major legislation, I think the next kind of interim legislation will be refilling the Paycheck Protection Program, which we need to do. Republicans in the Senate are trying to do it, and right now Democrats are blocking it. They're holding it hostage for unrelated partisan objectives. I think we'll end up getting that done. I don't think the Democrats will be able to hold this line. The program's run out of money now, and there is so much demand and so much interest that I think it's just untenable for Pelosi and Schumer to say, well, we've got all these other things we want, so we're going to just leave small businesses out in the cold to try to get it. I don't think they're going to hold that line. Next month, I think we'll come back with additional legislation. My hope is the additional legislation will not be nearly as much relief legislation like this last one was, but instead will be recovery legislation. It will be focused on, okay, small businesses have opened their doors. They're now starting to come back. Let's look at policies that will help them come back more quickly, help them return to profitability, help them to start booming and thriving again. And that includes things like tax reform, simplifying the tax code, lessening the tax burden. That includes things like regulatory reform. You know, we've seen across the country hundreds of regulations suspended during this crisis, federal regulations, state regulations, local regulations. I think the operating presumption ought to be every regulation that was suspended during the crisis should stay suspended during the recovery. That if it was good for economic growth when everything was terrible, it ought to be good for economic growth coming out of it. I think that's a good place to start, but we're going to need to work creatively to help small businesses grow Texas and grow the U.S. economy out of this crisis we're in right now.
Yeah, okay, so last question, and then we'll let you go, and then Matt will do a little closure with our team here. And there's still a lot of questions in the queue. That's good news. Everybody wants to talk to you, so that's a good news thing. But I'm going to try to combine a few questions here. You talked a little bit about some changes long-term in the domestic policies that you're hoping to see. What about foreign policy? Because this is not just a domestic problem.
No doubt, and let me address two foreign policy components of it. One, on the oil and gas side. I've spent a great deal of time in the last several weeks talking with Saudi Arabia. What Saudi Arabia and Russia did is they took advantage of this global pandemic to try to bankrupt Texas energy producers. And it was an act of economic hostility and aggression. I spent an hour and a half just this last Saturday on the phone with the Saudi energy minister and the Saudi ambassador, pounding the living daylights out of them and making perfectly clear that this economic assault on Texas and millions of jobs in Texas was not acceptable. Their defense has been, but Russia. And my response to that is, I don't give a damn about Russia. Russia is our enemy. They behave like our enemy, and we treat them like our enemy. You're supposed to be our friend. And if you want us to treat you like Russia, okay, fine, then we'll pull our soldiers out of Saudi Arabia, and we'll pull the Patriot missiles out of Saudi Arabia that are defending you right now. And the next time you get in hot water in the Middle East, don't call the U.S. Pentagon to bail you out. I can tell you those conversations, and I joined up with a total of 13 senators, all from energy-producing states. We've had multiple conversations. As we talked about a minute ago, I flew up to D.C. to meet with the president a couple of weeks ago on energy. And just this weekend, the Saudis announced a plan to reduce production by 10 million barrels a day and potentially as much as 20 million barrels a day. That's had some positive impact. But for energy more broadly, we got to get the economy moving. That demand has dropped about 40% for energy because nobody's driving their cars, nobody's driving their trucks, and nobody's flying jet airplanes. And until we get back driving our cars and trucks and flying planes, energy is going to be hurting. Another foreign policy aspect of this is China, and the China piece is really big and really significant. And I do think one of the consequences of this pandemic is it is going to fundamentally change the relationship of the United States and China for decades going forward. Now, I have long believed and long made the case that China is the greatest geopolitical threat facing the United States over the next century. China bears enormous responsibility and enormous culpability for all the damage and death and destruction that has resulted from this crisis. They bear that responsibility on three different levels. Number one, there is a very real possibility they were directly responsible for the outbreak. We know that there were 2 labs in Wuhan, in the immediate vicinity of the outbreak, that were studying not just coronaviruses, but coronaviruses found in bats. That raises a very real and natural inference that they were studying this particular virus and that it accidentally escaped. No one thinks they deliberately released it on their population, but there had been widespread criticism. There were 2 State Department cables from before the pandemic, US State Department cables, raising issues about the level of security at these labs, that they weren't protecting properly against an accidental infection and that could lead to a global pandemic. So our government was worried about a pandemic coming from these labs before it happened. And there needs to be, I think, real investigation and accountability over whether that happened and how it happened. Secondly, what we do know for a fact right now is China engaged in a vigorous cover-up. That when the outbreak began, they did everything they could to silence it, to hide it, to pretend it didn't exist. You know, there were physician whistleblowers in China who bravely tried to blow the whistle and draw attention to this back in December of last year. The Chinese government came down on them, brought criminal charges against them, silenced them, did everything they could to prevent anyone from knowing. Had they behaved like a responsible government and responded to the outbreak by putting professionals, health professionals in place, there's a real possibility we could have contained this outbreak to being a regional outbreak. We could have quarantined everyone involved and stopped the global pandemic before it happened. In a very real sense, the 140,000 lives that have been lost are directly the responsibility of the Chinese Communist government's cover-up that they carried out in December and January and February. And then third, as a long-term question to consider, I think we need to seriously reassess how much of our supply chain has moved to China, especially for critical infrastructure, for things like pharmaceuticals and vital medical equipment. You know, we're seeing shortages of PPE, of protective equipment. Most of that is manufactured in China. When it comes to pharmaceuticals, a vast percentage of the pharmaceuticals, of the medicines we rely on, are manufactured in China. That was a deliberate strategic decision by the Chinese government. And we saw in the course of this crisis a newspaper owned and controlled by the Chinese government threatening the US as a tool of warfare that they would cut off our medicines. They would just halt sending medicines to America. And we're talking about antibiotics, we're talking about blood pressure medicines, heart medicines. You know, that's not just economic warfare at that point, that's real warfare. That is China threatening the lives of Americans, denying them medicines we need to stay alive. And it is foolhardy for the United States to allow a hostile foreign power like the communist government in China to have control over so many lives of Americans. And I think there's going to be a real and extended discussion about how do we bring some of that supply chain back to the United States, especially the critical infrastructure and the medical. And so all of those on foreign policy are major focuses of mine, and I think we'll see a lot more discussion of all of those.
Senator, thank you so much for being with us today. We really appreciate your time and your insight. We know you have a very busy schedule, so we're going to go ahead and let you move on to your next, the next group that you're going to be speaking with. I think you have media next, so brace thyself.
Well, Matt, thank you. And let me very briefly say, in closing up, Matt and Rick, thank you for hosting, and to everyone who participated, 2 things very briefly. Number one, thank you. Thank you for everything you're doing in your businesses, with your employees, with your families, with your communities. Thank you for your leadership at a time of crisis like this. It makes a real difference. And number 2, just a word of encouragement. We're going to make it through this. Texans are strong and resilient. Americans are strong and resilient. We've faced enormous challenges in the past. We've faced 2 world wars. We've faced the Great Depression. We faced 9/11. We faced global health pandemics before. We will defeat this, and we'll defeat it the same way we always do, by coming together, standing strong, standing united. I'm proud to stand with the men and women of Waco, and thank you for your leadership at this time of crisis.
Senator, thank you very much. And we very much appreciate your leadership as well. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. God bless.
Yes, sir. Thank you. And folks, thank you all very much for joining us. Before you all make your way off of the webinar, let me share a couple things with you, a couple of programs that are coming up that you may find of interest. On Tuesday the 21st at 2 p.m., we have Katie Mahoney who's going to join us, and we'll get information. I think information's already gone out to you, but we'll get additional information out. Katie leads the U.S. Chamber's health policy. And so the topic of this webinar is going to be focusing on COVID in the workplace. And I think you'll find it very interesting. In addition, on Wednesday, the following day, we have the Texas Workforce Commissioner, Commissioner Alvarez, with us. And again, that information has gone out to you, but watch for additional information. We hope you plan to join us for that as well. The last thing I would share with you today is we just sent out a survey to our membership, and I hope you had a chance to take a look at that. If not, we encourage you to open up that survey or go to our website where the survey exists and complete it for us, because it's really going to help inform our understanding of our local economy, and then that information is going to be important as we share it with local, state, and national leaders as well. So thank you all very much for taking time to be with us today. We're here for you. We're working hard on your behalf, and we appreciate everything you do for your chamber and for your community. Take care.